June 22, 1941. The western border of the Soviet Union stood frozen in anxious anticipation. At dawn on this day, history would turn one of the most tragic pages of the 20th century. 3.5 million Wehrmacht soldiers concentrated along the border, prepared to deliver a devastating blow. 190 divisions against 170 Soviet ones. But it wasn't just about numbers. The German army had 2 years of experience in modern warfare in Europe, a well-tuned command system, and a clear plan of action. Operation Barbarossa envisioned a lightning defeat of the Red Army in 8 to 10 weeks. 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, were to cleave through the Soviet defenses and, advancing towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, encircle and destroy the enemy's main forces. Soviet troops stretched along the border were in the process of reorganization. New equipment was just arriving in units. Commanders were mastering modern methods of combat. Stalin, fearing to provoke Hitler, forbade putting the troops on full combat alert, despite numerous intelligence reports about the impending attack. The fate of millions of people hung in the balance. Plan Barbarossa, developed by the German command at the end of 1940, envisioned the lightning-fast defeat of the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Hitler was convinced that the colossus with feet of clay would collapse from a single powerful blow. 3 army groups were to deliver devastating blows in 3 strategic directions. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal von Lieb, targeted Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Bock, rushed towards Minsk and then Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was to seize Ukraine and advance towards the Caucasus. German strategy was based on the experience of the Blitzkrieg in Europe. Swift tank wedges cut through enemy defenses, encircled large troop groupings, and then systematically destroyed them. In the first days of the operation, this tactic worked flawlessly. Tank groups led by Gotha, Guderian, Kleist rapidly advanced deep into Soviet territory, creating huge encirclement pockets. The Luftwaffe dominated the air, systematically destroying Soviet aviation on airfields and supporting advancing units. German commanders acted according to a well-rehearsed scheme, showing initiative and exploiting weaknesses in Soviet defenses. However, already in the first days of the war, Plan Barbarossa began to falter. The Red Army, despite the shock of the sudden attack, offered fierce resistance. German generals noted with surprise that Soviet soldiers continued to fight even in hopeless situations. Encircled units were in no hurry to surrender, but tried to break through to their own or went into the forests, forming partisan detachments. A particularly difficult situation for the Wehrmacht developed in the southwestern direction, where the Soviet command managed to organize counterattacks near Dubno, Lutsk, and Rovno. Although these counterattacks did not achieve strategic success, they significantly slowed down the advance of Army Group South. German generals, for the first time, encountered an enemy who did not act according to the rules of European wars. The vast expanses of the Soviet Union proved too immense for a classic blitzkrieg. Stretched communications, poor roads, supply problems, all this gradually reduced the pace of the German offensive. By the end of June 1941, it became clear that the initial plan for a lightning war required serious adjustments. Despite enormous losses, the Red Army continued to fight, and the Soviet leadership mobilized all the country's resources to repel the aggressor. At 4 o'clock in the morning on June 22, 1941, the peaceful silence of the Soviet border was shattered by the roar of thousands of cannons. The sky was lit up by flashes of explosions, and the earth trembled under the blows of bombs and shells. The war began without declaration, without warning, without formalities, like a knife in the back of a sleeping man. Border outposts were the first to take the hit. Many of them were destroyed in the first minutes of battle. Those that survived resisted desperately, sending alarming reports to headquarters. "We are under fire. The war has begun." But communication in many places was already disrupted. The command of the border districts found itself in an informational vacuum. The suddenness of the attack paralyzed the troop control system. A directive to bring troops to combat readiness was sent from Moscow only at 0 hours 30 minutes, 3.5 hours before the invasion began. It simply did not reach many units. Luftwaffe planes struck Soviet airfields, where undispersed aircraft stood in dense rows. On the first day of the war, Soviet aviation lost more than 1,200 aircraft, most of them on the ground. Pilots who tried to get airborne faced superior enemy forces. Squadron Commander Ivan Ivanov was one of the first to perform an aerial ramming, directing his fighter jet at a German bomber. Artillery units located in the border strip found themselves without ammunition. Shells were stored in warehouses, many of which were destroyed in the first hours of the war. Tank formations, deprived of fuel and ammunition, became easy prey for German aviation. Divisional and corps headquarters, having lost contact with their units, could not organize coordinated resistance. Soldiers and officers in border garrisons showed miracles of heroism, but without unified leadership, without air and artillery support, they were doomed. Many commanders made decisions independently, based on the situation. Some units retreated deep into the territory. Others took up all-round defense. Still others tried to counterattack. But there was no overall system in these actions. The suddenness of the attack played a fatal role in the fate of the Western military districts. By noon on June 22nd, German tank wedges had advanced up to 50 kilometers deep in many sectors of the front. Communication between formations was disrupted. Troop control was lost. Thousands of soldiers and commanders died in the first hours of the war, without even having time to realize what was happening. But even in this catastrophic situation, the Red Army did not break. Separate pockets of resistance arose along the entire front line. Border guards stood to the death. Artillerymen fired at tanks with direct fire. Infantrymen repelled attacks by superior enemy forces. The suddenness gave the Germans a huge advantage, but it did not bring them an easy victory. Already on the first day of the war, they encountered something they did not expect: the desperate resistance of Soviet soldiers, ready to fight to the last bullet. The Western Front, covering the Belarusian direction, bore the main brunt of Army Group Center's attack. Here, the German command concentrated maximum striking power. Guderian's and Hoth's two tank groups, which were to close like pincers east of Minsk. On June 22nd, at 4 in the morning, thousands of guns opened fire on Soviet positions. Front Commander General Pavlov found himself in a critical situation. Communications with units were disrupted. Aviation suffered heavy losses in the first hours, and German tank wedges rapidly cut through the defenses. By the end of the first day of the war, the situation became catastrophic. The 3rd and 10th Armies were threatened with encirclement. Mechanized corps, which could have launched a counterattack, were scattered at significant distances from each other, without fuel and ammunition. On June 23rd, Pavlov attempted to organize a counterattack with the forces of the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps in the Grodno area, but this attempt ended in failure. Tank formations were committed to battle piecemeal, without reconnaissance or air cover. German tanks and aircraft methodically destroyed Soviet equipment. By June 25th, German tank groups had advanced up to 200 kilometers deep. Hoth's 3rd Tank Group captured Vilnius and advanced towards Minsk from the north, while Guderian's 2nd Tank Group, having crossed the Berezina, advanced from the south. On June 28th, the tank pincers closed east of Minsk. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and officers were encircled. The capital of Belarus fell on June 28th, just 6 days after the start of the war. This was a crushing defeat that threatened the entire defense in the Moscow direction. The front command lost control of its troops. General Pavlov, accused of criminal inaction, was recalled to Moscow and later shot. the encircled Soviet units continued to fight, trying to break out of the pocket. Many failed.
Tens of thousands of fighters died or were taken prisoner. But even in this catastrophic situation, there were examples of incredible resilience and courage. Colonel Chernyakhovsky's 101st Tank Regiment, the future army general, held back the onslaught of superior enemy forces near Grodno for 3 days. Artillerymen of the 447th Corps Artillery Regiment, finding themselves encircled, knocked out 28 German tanks and held out until the last shell. In the pre-dawn silence of June 22, 1941, the Brest Fortress slept. Located right on the border, it was the first to bear the brunt of the German troops' attack. At 4:15 in the morning, thousands of shells rained down on barracks, command posts, and warehouses. The fortress garrison, consisting of units from the 125th Rifle Regiment, the 42nd Rifle Regiment, and the 6th and 42nd Border Detachments, numbered about 3,500 people. The fortress also housed family members of commanders, women, and children. The first hours of the defense were chaotic. Commanders hastily gathered soldiers, organized defenses, and distributed meager ammunition supplies. Communication with the outside world was lost almost immediately. The German command planned to capture the fortress in 8 hours, but miscalculated. By noon, it became clear that a blitzkrieg would not succeed. The defense of the fortress was divided into several strongholds. On Central Island, soldiers fought under the command of Captain Zubachev and Regimental Commissar Fomin. In the citadel, Major Gavrilov led the defense. At the Kobrin fortification, Lieutenant Vinogradov. The Germans threw new forces into the attack, using flamethrowers, heavy artillery, and aviation. Thirst became an especially severe trial for the defenders. The Germans controlled access to the Mukovets River, and obtaining water turned into a deadly undertaking. At night, soldiers crawled to the river under machine gun fire to fill their canteens. Many did not return. Inscriptions appeared on the fortress walls, becoming a symbol of resilience. "We will die, but we will not leave the fortress. I am dying, but I do not surrender. Farewell, motherland." These words were carved with bayonets and written in blood by people who understood they were doomed, but not broken in spirit. By the end of June, organized resistance in the fortress was suppressed, but individual groups of fighters continued to battle. The last defenders held out until the 20th of July. Major Gavrilov was taken prisoner, severely wounded on July 23rd. On the 32nd day of the war, German officers noted with astonishment the incredible resilience of the fortress defenders. The commander of the Fourth Army, General Kubler, was forced to admit, "The Russians in Brest-Litovsk fought with exceptional persistence and stubbornness. They showed excellent training and an astonishing will to resist." The Brest Fortress became a symbol of the heroism of Soviet soldiers. In a hopeless situation, without communication with command, without air and artillery support, without sufficient ammunition, water, and provisions, they fought to the last bullet, to the last breath. Their feat showed that even in conditions of strategic catastrophe, the spirit of the Soviet soldier was not broken. The northwestern sector of the Soviet-German front in June of '41 became the arena for one of the most dramatic tank battles of the early period of the war. The Baltic Special Military District, transformed at the start of hostilities into the Northwestern Front under the command of Colonel General Kuznetsov, possessed an impressive tank grouping. 3 mechanized corps, numbering over 1,000 tanks, including the latest KV and T-34s. However, this power proved largely illusory. On June 23rd, the Front Command launched a counterattack with the forces of the 12th and 3rd Mechanized Corps in the direction of Shioliai. The plan was bold, to halt the advance of Hepner's 4th Panzer Group and restore the situation on the border. But the implementation of this plan turned into a catastrophe.
Tank formations were committed to battle piecemeal, without proper air support and reconnaissance. General Shestopalov's 12th Mechanized Corps was thrown into battle from the march, when the crews were already exhausted by a multi-kilometer trek. A significant portion of the vehicles broke down due to technical reasons, without reaching the battlefield. The latest KV and T-34 tanks, superior to German vehicles in combat characteristics, constituted only a small part of the Soviet tank fleet. The main bulk consisted of light T-26s and BTs, vulnerable to enemy anti-tank artillery. The German command, having air superiority, quickly identified the direction of the Soviet counterattack. Hepner's tank divisions met the advancing Soviet units with well-organized anti-tank defenses. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, used as anti-tank weapons, fired upon Soviet tanks from distances inaccessible to return fire. The tragedy was compounded by problems with communication and control. Corps commanders often lacked information about their neighbors, acting blindly.
Radios were scarce, and those that existed often broke down. Orders were transmitted via messengers, who did not always reach their addressees. By June 25th, both corps had lost most of their tanks and were forced to retreat. General Kirkin's 3rd Mechanized Corps lost up to 70% of its combat vehicles. The 12th Corps was practically destroyed. The path to Daugavpils and further to Pskov was open for German tank divisions. The reasons for this defeat are multifaceted. The low technical readiness of the vehicles, the lack of spare parts, fuel and ammunition played their part. But the key problem was the lack of experience in conducting large-scale tank battles among the Soviet command. The tactic of massive tank deployment, developed in the 30s, proved ineffective against the flexible anti-tank defense of the Germans, supported by aviation.
In contrast to the disaster on the Western Front, the troops of the Southwestern Front under the command of Colonel General Mikhail Petrovich Kirponos managed to organize more effective resistance. Here, the Soviet command had 5 mechanized corps, numbering about 2,000 tanks. The German Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal von Rundstedt, did not advance as rapidly as Army Group Center in Belarus. On June 23rd, the front commander received a directive from the Stavka to launch a counterattack. 5 mechanized corps were to deliver a devastating blow to German tank wedges in the Dubno-Lutsk-Rivne area. The plan was grandiose: to encircle and destroy Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, which had broken through into Soviet territory. However, the implementation of this plan faced serious difficulties. The mechanized corps were located at a significant distance from each other. Some had to march 200 to 300 kilometers. General Ryabashev's 8th Mechanized Corps entered battle only on June 26th, having covered more than 200 kilometers in 3 days. At the same time, about a third of the vehicles broke down due to technical reasons. Despite this, the Soviet counterattack near Dubno came as an unpleasant surprise to the German command. General Feklenko's 19th Mechanized Corps was particularly successful, striking the flank of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. German tank crews encountered the newest Soviet KV and T-34 tanks for the first time, which significantly surpassed German vehicles in armor protection and armament. The commander of the German 48th Panzer Corps, General Kempf, reported, "Russian tanks are invulnerable to our anti-tank weapons. Only 88mm anti-aircraft guns are capable of fighting them." German tank crewman Otto Carius recalled, "We watched in horror as our shells bounced off the armor of the Russian giants." However, the tactical superiority of individual Soviet tanks could not compensate for strategic miscalculations. The counterattack was not properly coordinated. Mechanized corps were introduced into battle piecemeal, without proper air support. German aviation inflicted devastating blows on Soviet tank columns. By June 30th, the Soviet counterattack had run out of steam. The mechanized corps lost 50 to 70% of their tanks, However, they partially accomplished their task. The advance of army groups south was significantly slowed down. While Minsk fell on the 6th day of the war, Kyiv held out until mid-September. The experience of the counterattack near Dubno-Lutsk-Rivne showed that even in conditions of strategic surprise, the Red Army retained the ability for organized resistance. This counterattack became the first major tank battle of the Great Patriotic War, and a harbinger of future tank battles near Prokhorovka and Kursk. The tactic of cauldrons became the hallmark of the German blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front. Its essence lay in the deep penetration of tank wedges into the enemy's defenses, followed by the encirclement of large groupings of Soviet troops. Wehrmacht tank divisions, possessing high mobility and supported by aviation, broke through the front at army junctions and rapidly advanced deep into Soviet territory. Infantry divisions followed them, widening the breaches and blocking the encircled units. This is how giant cauldrons were created near Bialystok and Minsk, Uman, Kiev, and Vyazma. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and officers found themselves in the Bialystok-Minsk cauldron. In the Kiev cauldron, over 600,000. The fate of the encircled was tragic. Deprived of supplies, ammunition, fuel, and food, they tried to break through to their own. Some succeeded. Colonel Ivan Biryukov, commander of the 108th Rifle Division, managed to lead more than 6,000 soldiers out of the encirclement near Minsk. General Potapov, commander of the 5th Army, organized a breakthrough from the Kiev cauldron, preserving the battle banner and staff documents. But most of the encircled died or were captured. The German command viewed prisoners as cheap labor and potential collaborators. The conditions in the camps were horrific: hunger, cold, lack of medical care. Many could not endure and died in the first months of captivity. Why did Soviet troops so easily fall into encirclement? There were several reasons. The linear defense structure without echelonment in depth made the front vulnerable to breakthroughs. The lack of mobile reserves did not allow for a prompt response to enemy breakthroughs. Poor intelligence and insufficient interaction between branches of service exacerbated the situation. Commanders, fearing accusations of cowardice, did not dare to retreat in time. Orders from the high command often did not correspond to the real situation. Stalin categorically forbade retreat, demanding counterattacks at any cost. This led to troops remaining in threatened areas until the last moment, when escape from the forming cauldron became impossible. The fate of the Southwestern Front in September 1941 is particularly indicative in this regard. Despite the obvious threat of encirclement, the Stavka forbade withdrawal from Kiev. As a result, 4 armies were encircled, and the front commander, General Kirponos, died attempting a breakthrough. Nevertheless, even in hopeless situations, encircled Soviet units continued to fight, tying down significant enemy forces. The heroic defense of Mogilev, which lasted 23 days, became a symbol of the resilience of Soviet soldiers in encirclement. General Romanov's 172nd Rifle Division repelled dozens of attacks, destroying up to 30 German tanks and over 1,000 enemy soldiers. Even when ammunition ran out, the defenders of Mogilev continued to resist, using grenades and bayonets. The history of war is not only a chronicle of defeats and victories of armies, but also a chronicle of the feats of individuals, whose names are forever etched into the heroic annals of the 41st year. In the first days of the war, when the front was collapsing and entire armies were encircled, it was often the personal courage of individuals that became the core that prevented the entire defense from breaking. On June 22nd, Lieutenant Dmitry Kokorev commanded an anti-aircraft battery near Brest. When German bombers appeared over the airfield, he, without waiting for orders, opened fire and shot down 3 enemy aircraft. His battery fought to the last shell, and then the artillerymen with rifles joined the infantry. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Gavrilov, finding himself in the burning Brest Fortress, gathered scattered groups of fighters around him and organized the defense of the casemates of the eastern fort. For 32 days, his small detachment fought in complete encirclement, without water, food, or medicine. The Germans offered the defenders to surrender, promising to spare their lives, but in response they heard only gunshots. Gavrilov was taken prisoner, severely wounded, when only he remained alive. The German officers who interrogated him did not hide their admiration for the resilience of the Soviet officer. A special page in the history of the first days of the war was written by Soviet pilots. On June 22nd, Junior Lieutenant Ivan Ivanov performed the first aerial ramming in the history of the Great Patriotic War, directing his fighter at a German bomber. He died, but the enemy was destroyed. On the same day, Ivanov's feat was repeated by several other pilots. Lieutenant Pyotr Ryabtsev rammed a German plane over Brest. Lieutenant Stepan Gudimov destroyed an enemy bomber with a ramming attack in the sky over western Ukraine. In total, on the first day of the war, Soviet pilots performed 15 ramming attacks. This was not the suicide of desperate people, but a conscious decision of fighters ready to give their lives, but not to let the enemy through. Many artillerymen in the first days of the war found themselves alone against German tank columns. A crew of an anti-tank gun under the command of Sergeant Nikolai Sirotinin on July 24th single-handedly engaged a German tank column near the Belarusian city of Krychev. Taking a position on a hill, Sirotinin knocked out 11 tanks and 7 armored vehicles before he was killed. The German colonel commanding the column ordered the Soviet artilleryman to be buried with military honors, saying, "If all the Führer's soldiers fought like this Russian, we would have conquered the whole world long ago." Border guards were the first to meet the enemy at dawn on June 22nd. Lieutenant Alexei Lopatin's outpost in the Vladimir Volyn border detachment repelled attacks from superior enemy forces for 11 days. When ammunition ran out, the border guards went on a bayonet charge. Out of 30 men, only 5 remained alive. The Red Army's command and control system faced a profound crisis in the early days of the war. When German bombs and shells rained down on border areas, the command of fronts and armies was literally blinded and deafened. Wired communication, on which the main reliance was placed, was destroyed in the very first hours by bombings and enemy sabotage groups. Radio communication, which could have been an alternative, was used sparingly. There weren't enough radios, qualified radio operators, and many commanders simply weren't accustomed to relying on this type of communication. Army General Georgy Zhukov, who became chief of the General Staff shortly before the war, recalled, "On June 22nd, we practically had no reliable information about the situation on the fronts. Reports were fragmented, contradictory, and often outdated by the time they were received. Army staffs didn't know what was happening in divisions, front staffs, in armies, and the Stavka in Moscow, on the fronts. Under these conditions, making adequate decisions was impossible. The situation on the Western Front was particularly telling." Commander General Dmitry Pavlov, for the first 24 hours of the war, practically had no communication with subordinate armies. When communication was partially restored, the incoming information was so fragmented that it did not allow for a complete picture. As a result, counterattacks by mechanized corps were launched blindly, without reconnaissance or coordination, leading to catastrophic losses. The situation at the Southwestern Front headquarters was little better. Commander General Mikhail Kirponos and military council member Nikolai Vatutin tried to organize a counterattack near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno, but orders simply did not reach many units. Corps and division commanders acted on their own initiative, often unaware of the situation of their neighbors.
The country's top leadership, lacking reliable information, made decisions that did not correspond to the real situation. The famous Directive No. 3, issued by the Stavka on June 22nd, demanded that troops go on the offensive and defeat the enemy on its territory. This directive, completely detached from reality, cost the lives of thousands of Soviet soldiers thrown into hopeless counterattacks. The contradictory nature of orders exacerbated the chaos. Some units received instructions to hold out to the last. Others were allowed to retreat. Commanders, fearing accusations of cowardice, often hesitated to withdraw troops without a direct order, even when encirclement became inevitable. June 22nd, 1941, became a day of catastrophe for the Soviet air forces. At 4 o'clock in the morning, German aviation launched massive strikes against airfields in the border districts. Luftwaffe aircraft, guided by experienced pilots who had undergone combat training in the skies of Spain, Poland, and France, descended upon densely packed rows of Soviet machines. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that most airfields were located in immediate proximity to the border, and the aircraft were not dispersed and camouflaged properly. By noon of the first day of the war, Soviet aviation had lost over 1,200 machines, of which about 800 were directly on the ground. Entire air regiments ceased to exist, not having had time to take to the air. On the Western Front, over 700 aircraft were destroyed. On the Southwestern, about 300. On the Northern, about 150. The losses of the newest aircraft, MiG-3 and LAG-3 fighters, PE-2 bombers, were particularly severe. The causes of this catastrophe were rooted in the general unpreparedness for war. On the eve of the invasion, the Air Force Command received the strictest order: not to succumb to provocations, not to violate German airspace, not to open fire first. The transfer of aviation to a wartime footing was forbidden. Aircraft stood wing to wing as in peacetime, presenting an ideal target. But even in these tragic circumstances, Soviet pilots displayed wonders of heroism. Those who managed to take to the air engaged in unequal combat with superior enemy forces. Already in the first hours of the war, the first aerial ramming attacks were carried out. Junior Lieutenant Ivan Ivanov, flight commander of the 46th Fighter Aviation Regiment, having expended all his ammunition, directed his I-16 into a German Heinkel 111 bomber. At the cost of his own life, he saved a Soviet airfield from bombing. On the first day of the war, Soviet pilots performed 15 ramming attacks, a feat unparalleled in the history of aerial warfare. Lieutenant Dmitry Kokorev, Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Ryabtsev, Lieutenant Stepan Gudimov. These names are forever etched in the history of Soviet aviation. Despite the catastrophic losses, Soviet aviation was not completely destroyed. A significant portion of the aircraft was located at deep rear airfields and avoided the initial strike. But air superiority was lost for many months. German bombers, practically with impunity, ironed columns of retreating Soviet troops, struck at railway junctions, bridges, and cities. The air battles of the first days of the war revealed not only the technical superiority of the Luftwaffe, but also serious problems in the tactical training of Soviet pilots. Most pilots had only 100 to 150 flight hours, compared to 500 to 600 for German aces. Combat experience was only among those who had been through Spain, Khalkhin Gol, or the Finnish campaign. They were a minority. The fortified areas, stretching along the western border of the USSR, were supposed to become an insurmountable barrier for any aggressor. The system of fortified regions, URs, began to be created back in the 1930s and represented a line of reinforced concrete, long-term firing points, connected by underground communications and field fortifications. Each UR included dozens of pillboxes equipped with artillery pieces and machine guns.
Theoretically, this system was capable of stopping any offensive. But on June 22, 1941, most of the fortified regions failed to fulfill their task. Why did this happen? The answer lies in a whole complex of reasons. First, many URs were under reconstruction. After the annexation of Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and the Baltic states, the border moved 100 to 200 kilometers to the west. The old line of fortifications ended up deep inside the territory, and the new one had only just begun to be built. Second, most of the pillboxes were not fully equipped with weapons and garrisons. Artillery pieces were often absent, and machine gun installations were not mounted. Third, many garrisons of the fortified regions did not manage to take up combat positions before the invasion began. Personnel were in barracks, and ammunition was in warehouses. The German command was well aware of the state of Soviet fortifications, thanks to intelligence data and aerial photography. The main attacks were carried out bypassing the URs, or at the junctions between them. Where it was necessary to attack the fortifications, the Germans used special assault groups, equipped with flamethrowers, explosives, and supported by artillery. However, some fortified regions offered serious resistance. The Brest UR distinguished itself particularly, where individual pillboxes continued to fight even after the front line had moved far to the east.
The pillboxes of the Vladimir Volinsky UR held out for several days, forcing the Germans to deploy heavy artillery against them. The defense of the Polotsk fortified region became legendary, where the garrisons of the pillboxes fought until the last cartridge. One of the pillboxes, commanded by Lieutenant Alexander Kolchin, held out for 18 days, repelling dozens of attacks. When ammunition ran out, the defenders blew themselves up along with the pillbox and the Germans surrounding it. Such examples of heroism were not an exception, but they could not change the overall picture. The UR system, on which such hopes were placed, did not fulfill its task. The reason is not in the quality of the fortifications or in the courage of their defenders, but in the general unpreparedness for war and the strategic miscalculations of the command. Fortified regions could only be effective as part of a general defense system, including mobile reserves, air cover, and artillery support. Without this, even the most powerful concrete structures remained only stationary targets. By June 1941, the combat training of the Red Army represented a contradictory combination of ambitious theoretical concepts and harsh practical realities. Soviet military doctrine, developed in the 1930s by such prominent theorists as Tukhachevsky, Triandafilov, and Isserson, was in many ways ahead of its time. It envisioned deep operations using mechanized formations, close interaction between branches of service, and massive use of aviation. On paper, everything looked impressive. But the practical implementation of these ideas faced serious obstacles. The wave of repressions in 1937-1938 dealt a devastating blow to the command staff. 3 out of 5 marshals were eliminated, 13 out of 15 army commanders, 60 out of 67 corps commanders, 136 out of 199 division commanders. Experienced commanders were replaced by young officers who lacked sufficient experience in managing large formations. Many of them feared showing initiative, fearing accusations of disloyalty. Constant reorganizations exacerbated the situation. In 1940-1941 alone, the army structure changed several times. New mechanized corps were formed, rifle divisions were reorganized, and airborne corps were created. Commanders and staffs did not have time to settle into new positions or establish interaction between units. The technical equipment of the troops left much to be desired. Despite the appearance of the latest KV and T-34 tanks, most tank units were equipped with outdated T-26 and BT machines. There was a shortage of communication equipment, engineering equipment,
and motor transport. Many artillery units lacked tractors and were forced to use horses. The combat training of personnel suffered from formalism and stereotyped approaches. Exercises were often conducted according to pre-designed scenarios that excluded the element of surprise. Primarily offensive actions were practiced, while defense received minimal attention.
This corresponded to the official doctrine: defeat the enemy with little blood on his territory. But it completely failed to prepare the troops for the realities of modern warfare. A particularly weak point was the training of junior commanders. The sergeant staff, which is the backbone of any army, did not receive sufficient knowledge and skills. The training period in regimental schools was reduced to a minimum. As a result, many junior commanders could not competently organize the defense of a platoon or company, establish interaction with neighbors, or control fire in battle. By the end of June 1941, the German offensive had reached terrifying proportions. The Wehrmacht's tank wedges, like red-hot knives, sliced through Soviet defenses, rapidly advancing towards key centers in the Western republics. On the Central Axis, the situation became catastrophic. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group from the south and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group from the north formed giant pincers, which closed east of Minsk on June 28th. 4 Soviet armies, the 3rd, 4th, 10th, and part of the 13th, were encircled. Over 300,000 soldiers and officers were trapped in the pocket, from which only a few managed to escape. Minsk fell on the 6th day of the war, an event that shocked the Soviet leadership. The capital of Belarus was a major industrial and transport hub, whose loss opened a direct road for the Germans to Smolensk and then to Moscow. The city's population frantically abandoned their homes. The evacuation took place under constant bombardment. The train station, crowded with refugees, was repeatedly struck by the Luftwaffe, leading to numerous civilian casualties. Events unfolded no less dramatically on the southwestern front. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, despite counterattacks by Soviet mechanized corps near Dubno, broke through the defenses and rushed towards Kiev. By the end of June, advanced German units reached Zhytomyr, creating an immediate threat to the Ukrainian capital. General Kirponos, commander of the southwestern front, made desperate attempts to organize a defense on the approaches to the city. However, the situation was complicated by the fact that a significant part of the front's forces was tied up in battles in the border zone. Stalin categorically forbade the surrender of Kiev, considering its retention a matter of not only military but also political importance. This decision would later lead to even more catastrophic consequences: the encirclement and destruction of the main forces of the southwestern front in September. The fall of Minsk and the threat to Kiev became symbols of the strategic catastrophe of late June. In 8 days of war, the Wehrmacht advanced 300 to 400 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. The pace of the offensive exceeded the most optimistic calculations of the German command. It seemed that Operation Barbarossa was being implemented even faster than expected. However, behind these impressive successes lay the first alarming signals for the Germans. Despite the encirclements and the rout of entire armies, Soviet troops did not cease their resistance. Individual units and formations broke out of the pockets, only to re-engage in battle. Pockets of partisan movement emerged along German supply lines. The Wehrmacht's losses, though incomparable to Soviet ones, were nevertheless significant, raising questions about the prospects of the campaign. In the history of the Great Patriotic War, a special page was turned by the dramatic events associated with the resistance of encircled Red Army units. When the main forces were retreating under the onslaught of the Wehrmacht, thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers continued to fight in complete encirclement, without hope of outside help, but with an unwavering faith in victory. Particularly tragic was the fate of the encircled units of the Western Front.
After the encirclement ring closed near Minsk at the end of June 41, more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves in a gigantic cauldron. The German command considered the operation complete, but reality proved otherwise. Instead of an organized capitulation, a fierce struggle began within the cauldron. Colonel Ivan Biryukov, commander of the 108th Rifle Division, finding himself surrounded, gathered scattered units around him and organized a breakthrough. For 6 days without sleep or rest, repelling continuous attacks, his group fought its way eastward. More than 6,000 soldiers were led out of the encirclement, preserving the division's battle flag and some heavy weaponry. No less heroically acted the group of General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front. Finding himself surrounded with his staff, he took command of scattered units and organized a breakthrough. For 45 days, Boldin's group fought its way to their own, covering more than 600 kilometers behind enemy lines. Colonel Sergei Biryuzov, commander of the 132nd Rifle Division, future Marshal of the Soviet Union, managed to lead the main forces of his formation out of the encirclement near Mogilev. When the encirclement ring closed, he decided to break through in small groups, using forest areas. Most managed to reach their own and join the ranks of the active army. However, not all encircled units managed to break through. Many decided to fight to the last bullet. The 204th Rifle Division of General Philip Prokhorov, encircled near Vitebsk, organized a circular defense and held out for 2 weeks. When ammunition ran out, General Prokhorov led a bayonet charge. He died in this battle, but some of his fighters managed to break through the encirclement. A special place in the history of resistance in encirclement is occupied by the defense of Mogilev. The 172nd Rifle Division of General Mikhail Romanov held the city for 23 days, tying down significant enemy forces. German troops were forced to storm the city, suffering heavy losses. Only when ammunition was running low did the defenders of Mogilev attempt a breakthrough. General Romanov died, but some of the soldiers managed to reach their own. The catastrophic defeats of the first weeks of the war forced the Soviet leadership to urgently seek answers to the question, how to stop the German offensive. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command, created on June 23, 1941, began to analyze the causes of failures and develop a new strategy. The first lessons of the war proved to be harsh, but necessary for the country's survival. One of the main conclusions was the understanding of the importance of layered defense. The linear deployment of troops along the border, without deep layering, made the front vulnerable to tank breakthroughs. Already in early July, the creation of new defensive lines deep within the territory began. On the approaches to Leningrad, Moscow, and in Donbass, thousands of civilians, women, teenagers, elderly people were mobilized to build anti-tank ditches, pillboxes, and trenches. The second most important lesson was the realization of the need for mobile reserves. The German pincer tactic was effective precisely because the Soviet command lacked the forces to quickly eliminate breakthroughs. In July-August, the formation of reserve armies in the rear began, which were not committed to battle in parts, but accumulated for decisive counterattacks. The tactics of aviation employment also underwent radical changes. While before the war the main emphasis was on offensive operations, now the priority became air defense of key objects. Aviation regiments were withdrawn to rear airfields. Aircraft were dispersed and carefully camouflaged. Special fighter units began to be created to combat German bombers. Particular attention was paid to tank troops. The experience of the first battles showed that dispersed use of tanks was ineffective. The formation of new tank brigades began, which were to act as a single fist and not be scattered to support infantry. At the same time, the production of new T-34 and KV tanks, which surpassed German vehicles in their characteristics, was rapidly expanded. Fundamental changes occurred in industry. On June 30th, the State Defense Committee was created under the chairmanship of Stalin, concentrating the full extent of power in the country. An unprecedented evacuation of industrial enterprises to the east began. In July-November 1941 alone, more than 1,500 large factories were evacuated. Machine tools were dismantled under bombings, loaded onto trains, and sent beyond the Urals, to Siberia, Central Asia. Many enterprises began operating directly in the field, in the open air, even before the construction of workshop walls. The system of training command personnel also underwent radical changes. Experience showed that pre-war training methods did not correspond to the realities of modern warfare. The duration of training in military schools was reduced to a minimum, but the programs became more practical, focused on specific combat tasks. Special attention was paid to the training of junior commanders, sergeants and lieutenants, who bore the brunt of the fighting. The price of the Red Army's defeats in the first weeks of the war was truly terrible. According to official data, by mid-July 1941, Soviet troops had lost about 2 million people killed, wounded, and missing in action. Of these, over 800,000 were killed or missing. More than 300,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner by the Germans. These were unprecedented losses for such a short period. No army in the world had known such a catastrophe. The losses of military equipment were no less appalling. By early July, the Red Army had lost about 6,000 tanks, more than half of its entire tank fleet. Over 7,000 aircraft were destroyed, and about 20,000 guns and mortars were lost. Many divisions lost practically all their equipment and turned into scattered groups of infantrymen. Mechanized corps, thrown into counterattacks in the first days of the war, suffered particularly heavy losses. The 4th Mechanized Corps of General Potaturchev, advancing on Shioliai, lost up to 80% of its tanks. The 8th Mechanized Corps of General Ryabyshev lost more than 400 out of 550 vehicles in the battles near Dubno. Soviet aviation suffered terrible damage. Entire air divisions were destroyed on the ground in the first hours of the war. By the end of June, the Red Army had lost air superiority in all directions. German bombers unpunishedly struck columns of retreating troops, railway junctions, and cities. However, behind the dry statistics lay human tragedies. Hundreds of thousands of families received death notices or notifications of missing persons. Millions of people found themselves in occupied territory. Tens of thousands of commanders and political workers died trying to organize defense or lead troops out of encirclement. But the most terrible consequence of the June 1941 catastrophe was the loss of the regular army. Most of those killed and captured were professional military personnel, officers and conscript soldiers who had undergone full training. Their places were taken by hastily mobilized reservists, many of whom had held weapons only during short-term training camps. The impact of these losses on the further course of the war can hardly be overestimated. The Red Army was forced to restore its combat capability practically from scratch, under conditions of a continuing enemy offensive. The loss of the western regions of the country, with their industrial and human potential, significantly complicated the task. And yet, the catastrophe was not fatal. The mobilization capabilities of the Soviet Union turned out to be much higher than the German command had assumed. By August 1941, more than 5 million recruits had joined the active army. Hundreds of factories were evacuated to the east, which soon began producing weapons and military equipment. Myths about the beginning of the war, like about any large-scale historical event, inevitably arise where there is insufficient information or where the truth is too painful. For decades, the border battles of June 41 have been overgrown with legends, distortions, and outright falsifications. It's time to separate the wheat from the chaff, relying on declassified archival documents and modern research. One of the most persistent myths states that the Red Army was completely unprepared for war, lacked modern weaponry, and was significantly inferior to the Wehrmacht in numbers. The reality is much more complex. By June 41, the Soviet Union had the largest army in the world, about 5 million people. In terms of tanks and aircraft, the USSR surpassed Germany and all its allies combined. The Soviet troops alone had more of the newest T-34 and KV tanks than all the tanks the Germans had on the Eastern Front. But quantity did not mean quality. Most Soviet tanks were outdated models, and many aircraft were inferior to German ones in terms of characteristics. The main thing, however, was that the command and control system, the tactical training of commanders, and the interaction of different branches of service were at a lower level than that of the enemy. Another common myth is about the complete surprise of the attack. Allegedly, the Soviet leadership had no information about the impending invasion. Documents indicate the opposite. Intelligence regularly reported on the concentration of German troops at the border, equipment transfers, and even specific dates for the start of the operation. Only in May-June 41, Stalin received more than 100 intelligence reports about Germany's preparations for war. Why then were adequate measures not taken? Here we encounter another myth about Stalin's fatal mistakes, allegedly not believing in the possibility of war. In reality, the Soviet leadership understood the inevitability of the conflict, but hoped to delay its beginning at least until the autumn of 41, when the army's rearmament would be completed. Measures were taken, but half-hearted ones, for fear of provoking Hitler into a premature attack. The myth of mass cowardice and desertion of Soviet soldiers in the first days of the war also does not stand up to criticism. Yes, there were cases of panic and flight from the battlefield, but there were many more examples of incredible courage and self-sacrifice. Brest Fortress, Liepaja, Przemysl, Mogilev. These pockets of resistance became symbols of the resilience of Soviet soldiers. Especially tenacious is the myth that the enormous losses of the first months of the war were in vain, that it was necessary to retreat to preserve forces. Modern research shows that even unsuccessful Soviet counterattacks had strategic significance. They slowed down the Wehrmacht's advance, gaining time for the evacuation of industry and mobilization of reserves. Without this resistance, albeit paid for at a terrible price, Moscow could have fallen as early as autumn 41. The catastrophic defeats of the first weeks of the war became a turning point in the history of the Soviet armed forces. The strategic consequences of the June tragedy of 41 were twofold. On the one hand, the country lost vast territories and millions of soldiers. On the other, it was this catastrophe that forced a radical rethinking of the entire military doctrine and troop command system. The first, and perhaps main, strategic lesson was the rejection of linear defense. By the autumn of 41, the Soviet command had moved to creating multi-echeloned defensive lines with strong mobile reserves. The uniform distribution of forces along the front was replaced by concentration on key directions. If in June the main forces were dispersed along the border, then already in the Battle of Moscow, the Germans' main strike was met by armies echeloned in depth. The tactics of employing tank forces also changed radically. The bitter experience of scattered counterattacks by mechanized corps, which were committed to battle piecemeal and without air support, led to the creation of a new system. Tank formations were withdrawn from the subordination of combined arms commanders and consolidated into tank armies. A powerful tool in the hands of the Stavka for delivering devastating counterattacks. The tragedy of Soviet aviation in the first days of the war led to a revision of the entire system of basing and employing air forces. Airfields were moved inland. Aircraft were dispersed and carefully camouflaged. Specialized air armies appeared, capable of massively supporting ground troops. The troop command system, which found itself in deep crisis on June 22nd, was completely rebuilt. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command abandoned petty tutelage of the fronts, granting commanders greater independence. An effective system of reserves was created, allowing for prompt reaction to changes in the situation.
One of the most important strategic consequences was the relocation of the industrial base to the east. Within months, thousands of factories were evacuated beyond the Urals, to Siberia and Central Asia. This titanic work not only allowed for compensating the loss of Western industrial regions, but also created a new industrial base, inaccessible to German aviation. The system of training command personnel also changed. Pre-war academic programs were replaced by short-term courses focused on practical combat skills. Frontline experience became valued more highly than theoretical knowledge. Commanders who distinguished themselves in battle were rapidly promoted, regardless of age or pre-war service. The defeats of 41 led to a re-evaluation of the role of the partisan movement. If before the war it received minimal attention, now partisans became an important factor of strategic significance. The central staff of the partisan movement was created, establishing the supply of detachments with weapons, ammunition, and trained personnel. The most important psychological consequence of the June catastrophe was the shedding of complacent attitudes. The slogan, "Little blood on foreign territory," was replaced by the understanding that a long and hard struggle lay ahead. This sobering experience came at a great cost to the country, but it was necessary for the mobilization of all the people's forces. A defeat that became the beginning of victory. A paradoxical thought, but it was the catastrophe of June 41st that laid the foundation for the future triumph of Soviet arms. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the Red Army managed to learn vital lessons from the terrible defeats of the first weeks of the war. These lessons, paid for with the blood of millions, became invaluable experience that transformed the entire military machine of the Soviet Union. In 43, when Soviet tanks advanced on the Kursk Bulge, and in 44, when Operation Bagration crushed Army Group Center, few recalled the panic and chaos of June 41st. But the connection between these events is indissoluble. It was the bitter experience of the first months of the war that gave rise to new tactics of deep tank breakthroughs, the art of massive artillery employment, and the mastery of air operations. The Germans, who devastated Soviet troops in the summer of 41, could not have imagined that they were teaching their future victors. Every successful maneuver was analyzed, every breakthrough studied, every strike became a lesson. The Soviet command learned from the enemy, adopting all the best and discarding the obsolete. The tragedy of the border battles forced a re-evaluation of the very philosophy of war. The pre-war doctrine of small bloodshed on foreign territory gave way to a sober understanding of reality. There was a realization that victory in modern war is not a brilliant cavalry charge, but a methodical work of the entire state mechanism, all the country's resources. Even the system for training command personnel was revolutionarily changed. If before the war military academies were taught by theorists, now combat experience was paramount. Officers who had gone through the crucible of 41 became mentors to young commanders, passing on not book knowledge, but mastery painstakingly acquired on the battlefield. The most important lesson was the understanding of the value of human life. If in the first days of the war soldiers were thrown into battle unprepared, without artillery and air support, by 43 the Soviet command had learned to conserve people. Offensives were now preceded by powerful artillery preparation, airstrikes, and thorough reconnaissance. The price of victory remained high, but it was no longer reckless. The defeats of 41 also tested the spirit of the people. They showed that Soviet people are capable of fighting even in hopeless situations, not giving up when, according to all military canons, they should have capitulated.
This unbending spirit became the foundation on which future victory was built. History is rarely fair to the vanquished. But the soldiers of 41, who took the first terrible blow of the Wehrmacht, deserve no less glory than those who took Berlin in 45. Without their sacrifice, without their fortitude, without the lessons learned from their defeats, there would have been no Stalingrad, no Kursk, no Berlin. They lost their battles, but laid the foundation for future victory. The phoenix rose from the ashes to fly higher than ever before.